Welcome back, students. We are now going to go through our second last learning unit, which is all about opposites and binaries. So, learning unit, it's learning outcome 2.2, or yes, 2.2. And it says, critically discuss the use of binary oppositions in the novella, drawing on post-colonial theory to consider how these binaries are perpetuated and or subverted and why. So, what are binary opposites? So, on a very simple level, and I've got a very twee little image here that I think represents it quite well. What are binary opposites? So, Ferdinand de Saussure, who is a French philosopher, posited this: means by which the units of language have value or meaning, each is defined against what it is not. So, the big point about a binary here is that you cannot have a definition of one thing without the other in a binary situation. So the example here that I'm going to give, which is very simplistic, is heat and cold. Cold is the lack of heat, and heat is the lack of cold. And therefore, without one another, they cannot be defined. You need to have them within relationship to one another that explains how they exist and what they are. However, something that Saussure argues, and something we're going to talk about here, is how this is meaningless because they are actually social constructs, and how things are defined based on what we understand them to be and how we have put them together in our own minds. So, what I'd like you to do, just as a quick little activity in your mind, is think about how many opposites you can think of. And how many of these do you actually think need to be defined by their partner? So I suggest you sort of just pause the video for 20 seconds and think however long that's going to take you, and think about what things cannot be described without their opposite. So the example I've given is heat and dark. Heat and cold, or hot and cold. But there's another example that I can give you, which is a nice example, is light and dark. Without darkness, you cannot define light, and without light, you cannot define darkness. So think about what other examples you can think of. So I've got a couple here that are defined specifically in Heart of Darkness, and the ones that I can think of are quite important. So you have black and white. Obviously, we've got the racial thing, which is very obvious. We also have savagery versus civilization. The hint I'm going to say here is who is savage and who is civilized. We have slavery and freedom. So who's free, who is not. Poverty and wealth, and who is working towards wealth. Humanity and animalism. So what makes you human and what makes you an animal? This is something that, although it's not as very explicit, there is definite hints to it. Good and evil, on a very simple level. Who is good and who is evil? The next is equality versus hegemony, equal, or where is there a power structure in play? And purity versus wickedness. Now this could fall under good and evil, but not quite entirely the same thing. So when we talk about binarism and post-colonialism, we're going to be looking specifically at how Sam Goovin discusses this. But what I've found here is that I found a lovely source that I've actually mentioned to you before, but it's a really nice reference for you. It's basically a dictionary of all the post-colonial terms you could possibly need. There's a link here, but there's also a link in some of your previous slides. And what I want you to think about is how binaries were created and enforced because they were ideological. And what they were doing was they were used to control both the colonizers and the colonized. Now, that might seem like a bit of a moment where you go, huh? And the reason I'm saying here is because nobody wants to acknowledge that there might be a gray area. There might be a mixing of the two, and there are taboo sides to the spectrum. What they wanted to do was enforce that there was one side which was right and one side which was wrong, which a lot of the time is where binaries fall into. They fall into this trend of good and bad. One is good, one is bad. And when we talk about binaries and how they enforced ideology, one of the things that they did was that they enforced the idea that the good side, if it mixed with the bad side, it would be tainted, it would be damaged in some way or short form, which means that your colonizing population were terrified of losing their status as being part of the good binary, and therefore behaved within collusion to make sure that they were not, by contrast to the colonized population, if that makes sense. So here's a nice little quotation which I've taken out from Guven, as I've done with the previous ones. I put it in the color. And this is a useful thing to think about how the binaries are portrayed in Hearts of Darkness. Colonialism is about the relationship between the colonized people and the colonizers. According to Louis Tyson, colonialist ideology was based on the colonializers' assumption of their own superiority, which they contrasted with the alleged inferiority of native indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants of the lands that they invaded. Now, this is very important, you need to keep in mind, is because this is still pervasive in Hearts of Darkness. We can't get away from that. There is still going to be that underlying notion that one is better than the other. However, there is definitely questions about how this supposed superior race are behaving, and whether they are actually behaving along their own definitions of superiority. So here are 4 specific examples, or 4 specific things that are mentioned by Guven that are highlighted in Heart of Darkness. The colonizers considered that the culture of their ancestors was extremely civilized, and that this is why they define native people as savage or underdeveloped. And this is one of those moments where the civilized, well, we have the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And I hope you hear the voice I'm putting on. They have this idea that there was this sense of civilization that they've had for thousands and thousands of years. However, obviously, it's very difficult for an Englishman to claim the ancient Greeks as heritage when they were on totally different parts of Europe. A sea divided them, and there was little to no racial links between them with the ancient Greeks. With the Romans, there was considerably more links, but they did not take on the form of civilization that was presented by these nations for hundreds. And they were considered to still be fairly barbaric for a very, very long time, in contrast to this perceived extremely civilized heritage. The colonizers see themselves as superior to the colonized people. Very, very standard, very simple. And I want you to think about how much of that ideology really has gone away. Colonizers think that they set up examples for the colonial people. So the colonized people were considered other or different. Remember, I mentioned othering, and therefore inferior to the point of being less than fully human. And this is something that we see a lot of, particularly in international portrayals of people of color. There is a tendency to characterize people. Caricature people, meaning we turn them into stereotypes of themselves rather than actual examples of a person. But we also tend to reduce them to less than human standards. There is this tendency to dumb down their identity. And what's great to see, though, is in modern literature, there's a big backlash to this. There's a big uprising against this. And you're seeing a lot less of this happening in modern literature, but it's taken a long time. And then lastly, that is the reason why colonized countries divide the world into 2 different parts. While they are named as us, the civilized, the natives are called as them, the others, or the savage. So can you think of any ideas during this text of where this happens? And I want you to think about this in your brain is, where can you think of examples where there is the us versus them mentality? And there are lots of them. So this should be quite simple to think of. One of the other things that Samet Guven represents here is how Conrad is deliberately trying to challenge the colonial identity. Because all of the negative characteristics that are usually attributed to the African population in colonial text, instead, he is attributing them to Kurds. And therefore, what does this make us think of? So, I believe that Conrad has chosen these words on purpose to criticize colonialism implicitly. Conrad hated imperialism in Central Africa because of its savageness, selfishness, and devastation. Kurtz's final words, the horror, are about how a civilized man can change to savagery when there is no restriction. In fact, the horror does not stem from the savagery of the natives. Therefore, Kurtz can be considered as corruption brought to Africa from Europe. Furthermore, the title of the book opens up to various interpretations. At the beginning of the novel, Marlowe calls Africa as one of the dark places on the earth. In fact, it can be said that the real darkness is in Europe rather than Africa, due to Europe's mistreatment of the natives. So, what Guven is identifying here is he's saying, yes, there are inherently racist discussions in this book. I do not deny it. But what he might be implying is that what Conrad has done is, instead of turning this text into just another colonial racist text, he has tried to show how all of the negative characteristics in binaries that we always look at as the opposite of European, the opposite of civilized, the opposite of educated, are in fact present not in the local population that we usually attribute them to during this time. Instead, they are present in the Western people. They are present in the Western civilization and how badly the Western civilization are in fact behaving. Now, obviously, this is a reading, and I'm interpreting the reading for you guys, and I'm discussing it with you. But what I want you to think about is this is a sort of contrapuntal argument to Achebe, and you need to decide where you sort of fall. And this will be something that you could sort of feel instinctively. Do you agree with Guven? Do you agree with Achebe? Or do you find that you kind of straddle the line and think both of you have points? So, Conrad writes with English readers in mind and does not let the natives speak. However, their silence can be interpreted as silent defiance against the European colonialism, since Marlowe does not regard the natives as savage, unlike traditional colonizers. And on the contrary, he is angry with Kurtz due to his mistreatment of the natives. Now, this is where I personally, in my interpretation, I get a little bit eyebrow raising. And the argument here is that the silence is resistance. And this is not an entirely unusual idea, that a character might be silent because they are resisting the power that is forcing them and compelling them to speak. However, I don't think that the natives are entirely silent. You have several characters of color that do speak, and we do see them represented. And the reason that they don't speak is because I'm not entirely sure, and this is a personal opinion, so please take this as I say it, I don't think Conrad would know how to write somebody of a different culture. And therefore, would he be effective in writing them? And is he aware of this? And therefore, he decided it's better to just leave them silent. That is my opinion, however. So don't get too caught up on that one. So here is a quotation from Heart of Darkness, where Heart of Darkness itself is highlighting binaries in itself, where it's talking about. We were wanderers on a prehistoric earth, on an earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. We would have fancied ourselves the first of men taking possession of an accursed inheritance, to be subdued at the cost of profound anguish and of excessive toil. But suddenly, as we struggled round a bend, there would be a glimpse of rushing walls, of peaked grass roofs, a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, a mass of hands clapping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling, under the droop of heavy and motionless foliage. The steamer toiled along slowly at the edge of the black and incomprehensible frenzy. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? We were cut off from the comprehension of our surroundings. We glided past like phantoms, wandering and secretly appalled, as sane men would be before an enthusiastic outbreak in a madhouse. We could not understand because we were too far, and we could not remember because we were traveling in the night of the first ages, of those ages that are gone, hardly leaving behind, and no memories. The earth seemed unearthly. We were accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could not look at a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were. No, they were not inhuman. Well, you know what was the worst of it? The suspicion of their not being inhuman. That would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours. The thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough. but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion that they were being the terrible suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of the first ages could comprehend. Now, this is quite a complicated extract, but what I want you to highlight here and identify is the fact that what is happening is in the first paragraph, we have this description of this sort of prehistoric, violent and savage identity. But then what you get to in the second paragraph is Conrad going, although it seems like this, there is something about this that we know is true to ourselves. There is something familiar and real to us, something we recognize and something we know of who we are. And therefore, the humanity here is not a comparison of barbaric versus civilized, or savage versus civilized. Rather, it's about we are both human. We just celebrate and experience different things. The obvious racism comes with the notion that he's suggesting that one nation is more civilized and further along than the other. But what is important to note is the fact that at the end of the day, whether civilized or not, there is commonality, there is familiarity, there is an identity that is coherent between both. So what I want you to do now is a little discussion, and this should be in an actual paragraph, where you're going to discuss the complex relationship that Conrad has to race in reference to the traditional colonial narrative of binaries. It's easy to dismiss Conrad as simply racist and falls parts of the traditional racial narratives, where the African population are classed as savages and primordial, and the Europeans as superior, if exploitative. While it's also easy to try to redeem Conrad's racism in the light of his crisis around the cruel and barbarous nation of European colonizers. So it's easy to fall on either side. It's easy to say, oh, he was just an old colonial racist, or actually he was challenging this and showing how the savagery and barbarism was the Europeans. So what I want you to do is discuss in a short essay of about a page whether you think Conrad is reinforcing racial binaries of savagery, or whether he is not. Do you think he stands by savagery versus civilization or doesn't? So here's a couple of things that you should think about. Think about how he describes the African people, for example, the mistress. Think about how he discusses the cannibals, how he discusses the death of his helmsman, how Marlowe views the skulls outside Kurtz's station, how he refuses to allow the pilgrims to have their fun and shoot people, and discuss the reflection on humanity from the previous quotation on the previous slide. So good luck with that. That's meant to be quite a challenging discussion, but there are lots and lots of ideas. I've given you a couple of pieces of evidence you should look at, but there's lots of other evidence that you should engage with in this text. And then for our final learning outcome, I would like you to make sure that you read Darkness in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a linguistic and stylistic analysis by Khalil Hassan Nafal, and this is, I believe, on your VC loan. Good luck, and I will see you for our last video on our last set of slides. Thanks, guys.